listener production.
Hey, Bension here. Spend a couple of years renting or trying to buy a house or both, and you might be thinking, why is this so goddamn infuriating all the time? Maybe it's because you've spent a full day filling out a rental application form that asks you for more private information than any employer that you've ever had has on you. Maybe it's because the thousands of dollars in bond you paid to the last landlord would absolutely cover most of the bond you have to pay the next one, but you have to come up with thousands of dollars and wait weeks while your old real estate agent decides if a stain that was definitely on the carpet before you arrived was, in fact, on the carpet before you arrived. Maybe it's because you really could afford a mortgage by now with the money you've been using to pay off someone else's, but you have to spend a decade getting a deposit together before you're allowed to start doing that. Whatever your personal frustrations, we're about to head into a federal election, and that means politicians at the national level will be trying to convince you that they have the solutions. Edward Cavanough is the chief executive of progressive think tank the McKell Institute, and he says they don't. He argues there's major problems with the Labor, the Coalition and the Greens housing policies, and none of them are focusing on four particular solutions he argues are staring us all in the face. Ed, welcome to the briefing.
Thanks for having me.
Portable bonds scheme is a pretty dry set of words, but it is an important idea. Tell me the problem first that you're trying to solve with a portable bonds scheme.
Yeah, so this is a bit of a technocratic term for what is kind of a simple problem that we want to solve. Now, every one of your listeners will realise if they're a renter, every time they go and rent a new place, they have to stump up several $1,000s in that process. You've got to pay a month's bond, you've got to pay a couple of weeks' rent in advance. This is $4,000, $5,000, $6,000 maybe in the highest value rental markets in Australia. The problem is when you move to your next house, often it takes a bit of time to get that bond money back, and then you have to find more money for the next bond, and often there's a big cash flow problem for renters. So increasingly what we've been seeing is this idea of portable bonds. So effectively you have a bond account which you contribute to ideally only once at the start of your rental life. That's an account that sits there and then can be transferred from one rental to the other. So this is already starting to be talked about at a state level. What we're proposing at the McKell Institute is for this principle to be taken nationally. And in addition to just having portable bond accounts for everyone who is renting, allow the money and the interest on that money in those accounts to actually go back to the renters rather than back to the government. So
just nuts and bolts. You're putting your bond down for your first rental property. That money goes to a government agency. The government agency holds it, and then when you want to finish that lease and go to a different property, what happens then?
Well, so the account basically stays with you, but then that money acts as the bond to your next rental. So of course, if you damage the property, some money would be taken out for that purpose, but effectively you have a single account just for you, and that shifts with you to the next rental.
And also that money can earn interest that can go to you at the end, is that right?
That's exactly right. So it'd accrue interest over time. So we have this situation now where if you're, say, 20, 21, 22, first getting into the rental market in a place like Sydney, you're likely to be renting for well over 10 years, probably 10, 12, 13, 14 years. The average age of home ownership is something like 33 or 34 in a place like Sydney. So if you're putting in $3,000 or $4,000 at the age of 21 or 22 for your first rental, over 10 or 12 years, that's obviously going to accrue significant interest. So your account will grow over time. It means that you can apply that money to your next rental. If you're going up to a more expensive rental and the bond accrues higher, you've got that money already accruing. And then when you eventually do decide to leave the rental market, whether you're buying a house, moving overseas, whatever it may be, you can withdraw your principal from the bond, but also the interest that's accrued over all of that time. And that's not insignificant amounts of money. In Sydney, that would be something like $2,500 to $3,000 for the average renter.
And would this be any skin off the nose of the landlord? Is there anything that would change in their experience?
Not at all. And I actually think it'd be the opposite. It's probably easier for landlords because it means that there's more security on those bonds. It means that you're not waiting a month for a good tenant who you've just said you want to come into your property to stump up the money for those bonds and finally move in. Our idea as well is to make this a national scheme so that people could move interstate easier and have portable bonds carried over state lines. And that means it's actually going to be easier and quicker, the entire process around getting tenants in, moving them on. Mobility is going to be easier. There's going to be less friction. So we think it's a good thing for both renters and landlords.
Okay, so portable bonds, that's idea number one. Tell me about idea number two, cracking down on dodgy rental tech.
We've seen over the last 10 years or so, this big issue emerge where there's all these sorts of intermediary services in the rental market. Say if you want to apply for a rental, you have to put your details into a app that the landlord prefers or that the rental agency prefers. You might have occasionally on those types of services a bonus option where you can effectively put your profile higher by paying $50 or $100. We also have all these services that have popped up over the last few years where agents and landlords actually prefer you paying rent via a certain payment mechanism, certain platform, whatever it may be. All of these sorts of intermediaries in the rental market have a cost. Sometimes it might just be a few dollars every time you pay your rent. Sometimes it might be $50 or $70 every time you have to use one of these intermediary apps. We think that's fundamentally a big problem. It's pushing costs onto renters who are already doing it really, really tough. So where there is a place for this sort of rent tech, these sort of applications, if landlords want them to be used, if rental agents want them to be used, we think there should be a universal principle across the country that the costs are actually borne by those that are effectively forcing renters to use them rather than being shifted back onto the renters. We need some more scrutiny and accountability and a bit of a crackdown on those that have entered this market and are just basically clipping the ticket on the way through and getting in between renters and landlords in a way that I think is unnecessary and is just adding to the cost for renting.
If these two ideas, portable bonds and cracking down on dodgy rental tech, are such good ideas, why haven't they happened yet? Why aren't we hearing politicians at the federal level talk about doing these kinds of things?
It's a great question because I think for a long, long time, federal politicians have effectively just ignored renters as an issue. The reality is we have as many renters in Australia as there are mortgage holders. But for whatever reason, federal politicians spend all day long, every day, talking about the interests of mortgage holders and barely pay any lip service to renters whatsoever. Now, there's some technical reasons for that in a way. Much of the rental landscape in Australia is overseen at a state government level, so that is understandable to a degree. But renters are already being, really feeling like they're being ignored at that national level. And I think this is slowly starting to shift. And one of the reasons why some of these quite common sense ideas, we're putting forward some pretty practical ideas that we've seen some movement on at a state level, but just not nationally. I think one of the reasons they haven't been talked about at that federal level is simply a culture of ignoring the interests of renters at the expense of focusing too much on homeowners and mortgage owners.
I will actually ask you about the interests of mortgage holders and homeowners in a moment, but let's go to your third idea. Commonwealth rent assistance. What's wrong with the way that it works now?
Yeah, so at the moment, Commonwealth rental assistance, which is pretty modest, it's only really applicable to a pretty specific cohort of recipients. Usually these are folks that are already on some form of Commonwealth income support assistance. It might be on job seeker, it might be on youth allowance, something like that. Effectively, how the scheme works at the moment is those that are already effectively in the welfare system are those that get access to this modest Commonwealth rental assistance. That leaves a big problem though, because there are some people now that are earning such low wages in this economy, but actually aren't in the welfare system at all, that are equally in need of Commonwealth rental assistance. We think there's a case for the existing Commonwealth rental assistance to be expanded into some of those lowest income working Australians who are renting. They don't need any other type of income support. They don't necessarily want to be in the welfare system, but there is this mechanism that's there that I think could be better targeted at times towards some of those folks that are working, doing the right thing, wanting to contribute as much as they can to society, but are just getting left behind by stagnant wages, increasing rents. And there's a case there for some direct support from the government for that cohort.
So you're talking about people who are on Commonwealth rent assistance, then there's people who are not and they're renting. And then there's this middle cohort who are on low enough incomes for us to describe them as low income workers, but they're not getting any assistance. Why not?
Part of this is people that say have been on the lowest income jobs in our society. They might be on an award wage doing a cleaning job full time. Their wages simply haven't gone up nearly at the pace as rents and other costs of the general cost of living over the last few years. So we've seen this emergence effectively of a working poor in Australia, which we haven't really had to the degree that we have now. That's a huge cause for concern. There's some longer term initiatives we'd want to see to improve that, of course. We want to see folks on those lowest wages earning higher wages, ideally. In this moment, though, of such challenge, I think there's a case for at least a modest degree of additional support for those that, as I said, they're not in the welfare system. They're not seeking any other support. They're not seeking any type of government assistance whatsoever. But there's a mechanism there through Commonwealth Rental Assistance that could potentially be expanded to a targeted cohort of those that are already working and aren't in the welfare system.
And the fourth idea is using people's rental history in some way to help them buy a house. How would that work?
Yeah, so we have seen over the last few years the Commonwealth Government create a whole sort of infrastructure of help to buy support. We've got these help to buy programs. We've got other schemes that effectively allow mortgage insurance, et cetera, to be covered by the government in a way, effectively. And some of these schemes, particularly the help to buy schemes and the shared equity schemes, are really effective. They're actually proving to be taken up by a lot of people. That's really great. One of the frustrations that renters have, though, is that the fact that they are a renter is actually more often seen as a liability than an asset and is not really leveraged into any attributes on their serviceability sort of record. So say if you've been paying $3,000 a month for 5 years for your rent of a house in Melbourne or something, you know you can spend $3,000 a month on a mortgage. But at the moment, that rental history, that actually doesn't contribute to your serviceability criteria. It's not really counted. You know, much of this has to do with interaction with the banks and lending criteria and all this sort of stuff. But we think there's an opportunity for the federal government with all these help to buy schemes to really better account for people's rental history and to factor that into the application process for these help to buy schemes, to at least have it as one of the attributes that goes into the assessment for these individuals going into these schemes. And what that does is not just practically help people, I think it really addresses some of the cultural problem we have with the way that we even talk about renters, because, you know, there's this whole sort of rent money is dead money myth, which I think is a real problem. And what we should instead be doing is saying, look, if you have been doing everything right as a renter, you've been paying your rent on time for years upon years, you should be rewarded for that. That should contribute to something. That should mean something. And that's going to help you get into home ownership faster should you choose to pursue it.
Some listeners might be listening to this and thinking, well, none of the politicians at the federal level have really spent much time talking about these kinds of policy ideas. I don't really know who this person is from this progressive think tank called the McKell Institute. What's your pitch to why they should take these ideas seriously from you?
Well, look, we have a system now in Australia where, like it or not, we're going to have at least a third of our country renting for a really, really long time, for maybe in many people's cases, their entire lives. This is not something to be ashamed about as a country. This is not a gigantic problem. Renting in much of the world is completely accepted and completely normal. The problem is we have always sidelined the interests of renters in our national policy debate. And the reason, as I was saying, that some of these common sense, low-hanging fruit ideas haven't been taken up is simply because there's been this sort of pejorative approach and language directed towards renters from federal politicians that effectively says, you know, how indignant is renting? How bad must it be being a poor renter? We're going to do everything we can to get them out of that situation. Well, every single year there's more and more percentage of Australians renting. It's only going to increase over time. And the length of a renting career is longer and longer and longer. It's going to stretch until people are probably in their 40s on average within the next decade or so. So it's now time to start to look at this cohort seriously and to shape national policy, national debate in the interest of renters just as much as anyone else in the economy.
We're about to hit a federal election, probably in April, maybe in May. Do you think any of these ideas are likely to make it into the policy platforms of the major parties?
Well, I'd certainly hope so. And what we have at the moment is a bit of a policy vacuum in this debate, largely because the federal government hasn't said or done a lot for renters. There was a sort of rental agreement with the states a couple of years ago that laid some basic conditions, which was welcome. It was called a better deal for renters, but it didn't go as far as some of these proposals. What we have on the table at the moment, really the only big ideas out there, one from the coalition is for renters to tap into their superannuation to buy a house. And then the other is from the Greens, is effectively a rental freeze nationally. There's problems with both of those proposals. The rental freeze issue is that all the state governments have said they won't do it. So irrespective if that's a good idea or not, that's very unlikely to proceed. And obviously, with the super for housing proposal, that doesn't really help renters. It's a big sacrifice having to tap into their super to get a house. So I think there's a big opportunity there for Labor to step into that gap and to ideally pursue the types of proposals that we're putting out on the table here today.
And finally, we've spoken a lot about renters during this discussion, but what about mortgage holders? They have the benefit of a big asset that's more than likely growing in value, but interest rates are also making life very difficult for many mortgage holders. Do you have any suggestions for them?
Look, it's very tough for mortgage holders too. And, I saw this myself. Like everyone else, my mortgage literally doubled soon after I bought a house back a couple of years ago for the first time. So totally understand that it's incredibly tough. I think more often than not, mortgage holders are very much struggling, but are often in a better financial situation. There are different set of issues for mortgage holders, of course, than there are for renters. We don't have a similar degree of policy proposal for mortgage holders specifically. Obviously, it's in the interest of mortgage holders for interest rates to go down and, for inflation to go down, et cetera. But where government has more direct control in the sort of cost of living experience of everyday people is in the rental market. So that's where we're turning our attention. But have absolute sympathy for mortgage holders. I can recognise how challenging it must be, particularly for those who are on modest incomes and have seen their mortgage double in the last 2 years. It's really tough out there.
Well, Ed, thanks so much for joining us on The Briefing.
Thanks so much.
Ed Cavanough there. He's the Chief Executive of the McKell Institute. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Briefing. That's it for now. Before you go though, we'd love it if you could share this app with someone you think might enjoy it. It's a really easy way you can support us and all we do here at The Briefing. You can also check us out on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast and on TikTok and YouTube. Search Listener Newsroom. I'm Bension Siebert. See you next time.